been really important to us at STAT, and we have a blockbuster team. And I just want to mention, since several of our team members are here tonight, I just want to mention them in particular. They're led by Erin Mershon. Erin, can you stand up? Where are you? Oh, there she is. Our newest hire is Sarah Overmall from Politico, who is now, as part of her many responsibilities, is now going to join in and do the second day a week of the DC Diagnosis newsletter beginning next month. Rachel Kors, where's Rachel? Stand up. Rachel Kors is right next to Sarah. Took over the DC Diagnosis newsletter earlier this summer from Nick Florco, and is doing a fabulous voicey job in addition to all her other duties. And speaking of Nick Florco, there he is. Nick, you know, from his coverage for many years here, and he has a new exciting beat that I don't think any publication has. He's now our DC-based reporter for the commercial determinants of health. And his first piece out of the gate was the FDA's challenges with vaping and regulating vaping. We also have right next to him Mr. Farmerlot himself in person, Ed Silverman, many of you know, who's very popular among our DC loyalists. We also have Jason Euchman, one of our managing editors based here in DC. We also have Patrick Scarrett. Where are you, Pat? There. Pat has built our First Opinion franchise from the very beginning. We've had over 3,000 contributors writing opinion pieces, many of them big policy people from DC and patient advocates. I also want to mention Mohana Ravdravnev. I always get your name wrong. Mohana, where are you? Mohana, many of you know from being in DC for years as a reporter for STAT. She's now moving in a week or two to San Francisco to join our health tech team based in San Francisco. So congrats to Mohana on that. I also want to mention, before turning it over, I promise, I just want to mention one of our, another big name STAT person who's here with us tonight, Matt Herper, who is, where are you, Matt? Who is Stand Up, our editorial director of events and our senior writer for medicine. And I also want to mention a brand new DC-based staff member who started a week ago, whose name is Sango Amalo. I'm sorry, don't put me up here. So everyone, Sango came to us from Bloomberg, and he is in charge of building our subscription base in DC, in this whole area. And so if you want to get a deal on Stat Plus, he's the man. Grab him. And his boss is here, Amanda Garces. Amanda, where are you? Stand up. If you want Amanda, if you want Sango to get points, you should go to, yeah, tell him how much. And then next to Amanda is our Chief Operating Officer, Angus McCauley. Stand up, Angus. Finally, now I just want to thank the reason we're all here tonight is our event sponsor, Alexion AstraZeneca Rare Disease. And I want to thank them for sponsoring this event. And last but not least, another really familiar face at STAT is Nick St. Fleur, who's our general assignment reporter, the host of our really popular Color Code podcast, which in its first season won an award for the best podcast in the country, just right out of the gate. And Nick is also our Associate Director of Events. So take it away, Nick.
And can we get a nice round of applause for Rick here? The man who made it all happen. Okay, see, that was a very strong round of applause. I want to hear more of those throughout the night, all right? All right? So to start us off, I'd like to introduce a pre-recorded testimonial from Walker Berger, who is a Barth syndrome study patient. Now, some of you might recognize Walker from Ed Silverman's recent story on the challenges for drug makers and the FDA in conducting clinical trials for ultra-rare diseases like Barth syndrome. We'll hear more about that later, but Walker has kindly taken the time to share with us his personal story. just want to say a thank you to Walker for sharing his story. I mean, we go through so many things that we do throughout the day, and as Walker said, imagine doing all of that with just a minuscule of the amount of energy you have. As he said, most people have this, and he has just a tiny bit right over there. So here to kick off this evening's program, on behalf of our presenting sponsor, I'd like to welcome Del LaBelle, Head of U.S. Government Affairs and Policy at Alexion AstraZeneca Rare Disease. Go right ahead, Del.
Thank you, everyone. And if that is not a story of inspiration, I don't know what is. I oftentimes feel like I have this much energy to get throughout the day, and that's inspiring to hear. But on behalf of Alexion, AstraZeneca Rare Disease, it is thrilling and exciting to be here in person, right? It's our first event, I think, externally as an organization where we're able to be in person. So it's an absolute honor. We're happy to be here, but even more, right, exciting about this is that everyone's gathered here for the purpose and the interest of rare disease, quite frankly. And so we're thrilled about that. So as we move forward through this program, I think the thing that we're most interested in is the key learnings that can come from an event, a convening, and a conversation like this. Rare disease is unique, as you'll hear throughout this evening. There are more than 10,000 rare diseases as we know it, and they affect approximately 300 to 400 million people. And what's sad about this is 95% of these rare diseases have virtually no treatment. And even more sad, quite frankly, is the fact that nearly half affect children. And so if that's not a message of what we have to do in this space, and I'm not sure what is. Unfortunately, the diagnostic journey is even more troubling, as it can take, on average, up to 5 years to get a diagnosis, more than 7 specialists, and numerous hospital visits, specialist visits along the way, tests that are not necessarily easy, and sometimes this results in hospitalization, and sometimes this even results, unfortunately, in the death, because there's not necessarily a treatment for these rare diseases that we are looking at. At Alexion, we have been on a 30-year mission to discover, to research, to commercialize, manufacture medicines to meet the needs that are clearly unmet. I am fortunate to be part of this journey for almost 2 years now, with a tremendous crew of colleagues that are 100% invested to really meet the unmet needs. As I said, we endeavor to discover life-changing and transformative medicines, and we're focused on the cascade complement, the complement cascade, rather, which is really one of our core expertise. And our interests span nephrology, neurology, cardiology, metabolic disease and disorders, and ophthalmology. And so now, as part of this mission, we have an opportunity to come together and look at the policy and the regulatory hurdles that can be essentially enhanced, right, and strengthened for this rare disease community. And so, we can certainly get diagnostic testing to newborns. We can, certainly encourage the FDA to bring, drug patient stories into the drug development conversation, but we also can go a long way to really think about shortening the diagnostic journey for these patients. And so that's what this is really all about. I encourage you to learn more about rare disease and Alexion more general at alexion.com. And we're thrilled to be here and look forward to the program. Thanks.
Hey, thank you so much, Del. Thank you. Now, for those of you who haven't been to a STAT event before, we like to make our events pretty interactive. So if you have any questions during any of the panels, just feel free, raise your hand, flag me down. You'll see me walking around the room with this here microphone, and you can ask your question. You don't have to wait until the end of the session. And sometimes these sessions go quicker than you would think. So if you have a question kind of bubbling at the surface, flag me down. We'll make sure you get to ask it. And now with that, I'd like to welcome our first session. I'm happy to welcome Congresswoman Robin Kelly, and to moderate my colleague, Stats Washington correspondent Rachel Cohrs, who just brings you exclusive after exclusive.
And we're good to go. Thank you so much for joining us tonight, Congresswoman. I really appreciate you being here.
Thank you for having me.
All right, so today we are here to discuss the NIH Clinical Trial Diversity Act. So we're all on the same page, we all have the same context. Can you tell me a little bit about what the bill does?
The purpose of the bill basically is to diversify clinical trials with the NIH. And we want the NIH to have their trial sponsors have clear and direct recruitment and retainment strategies. We want to make sure that once they get participants, that what they expect from them, at least to retain them, is less burdensome. And I kind of related to when we talk about the social determinants of health and lack of access. It's the same thing with clinical trials. It's hard to recruit and retain people of color because of those same access issues and issues of transportation, childcare, can't get off of work, and things like that. And then we're expecting more in the marketing realm, that you cannot use the same forms of recruitment to or marketing to recruit people of color. You have to be more creative in your approach.
All right, so tell me, how did this problem come to your attention? Why is it a priority for you?
I'm the chair of the Congressional Black Caucus Health Brain Trust, and I'm also the vice chair of Energy and Commerce. And health is one of my subcommittees. So I have a very heavy health portfolio, and it really came to us from different people talking to us, people coming to the office from different organizations, just things that we've learned from, all of our experiences. I remember with COVID, when we worked with Pfizer, Moderna, and Dr. Fauci, and we talked about, when you heard all of the people of color getting the disease, how many people were in your trials, and they were happy to have, I can't remember the number, it seems like such a long time ago now, but maybe African Americans, they were happy to have, 10% or something like that, and I think the Latinx population maybe was higher. So it was better than normal, but normally, like when you think of prostate cancer in men, black men have a 75% chance of getting it at 2 times the rate of dying from it than white men, yet they're only 10% of the clinical trials. When you think about breast cancer, black women and white women get it at the same rate, but black women die from it more. So just things like that, and working with so many different people and working with my colleagues also.
Exactly. So can you define diversity for me? Because that term can mean a lot of different things to a lot of
Sure.
different people, so I just wanted to give you an opportunity to elaborate.
Well, of course, we're talking about race and ethnicity, but we're also talking about gender. We're also, as I just said, with prostate cancer, also suicide. Men die from suicide, I believe 4 times higher rate than women. So we're talking about gender. We're also talking about age. We're concerned with younger women. I do a lot of work around maternal mortality and morbidity. So especially with Dobbs, there are more women and younger girls that don't have babies, that don't want to have babies, and the treatment. So we need to look at age-related clinical trials also.
Okay, excellent. And can you tell me why you think it's important to require the NIH to do this instead? Because I know that the FDA also has some suggestions for kind of diversity initiatives. Can you explain kind of why you decided to take that approach?
Because we feel like there needs to be rules and regulations that you have to get this done, because we've heard the stories over and over. Well, we tried, and we couldn't find the people, or we found the people, but we couldn't retain them, and we want to make sure that this gets done. And it's also, could be a matter of life and death. Everyone doesn't accept medicine in the same way medicines have different effects. Like before, when there weren't so many women used in clinical trials, it was just men. So we just feel like this is extremely important, and there needs to be must-haves, not, just maybe or try.
Sure. Yeah, so I think I just wanted to talk about like rare disease specifically, because that's what we're here to talk about tonight. And I know you mentioned that obviously in certain clinical trials, it is harder than others to, find participants, find diverse participants. So I wanted to ask, in kind of the process of crafting this bill, how did you take that into account and make sure these requirements wouldn't be burdensome or more difficult or hold up cures for people who might be waiting for them?
Well, we definitely want to include rare diseases, but again, from my work on the Brain Trust and my healthcare portfolio, we know that people that deal with rare diseases or have rare diseases feel left out in a way anyway, or they don't get as much attention because maybe it's not as many, of the population affected. So we don't have a one-size-fits-all formula, and we want to be inclusive and open. So we're not going to put extra constraints, and we want to know. We want rare diseases to have the diversity in their clinical trials like others, also because all kind of people have. It's not just one group or another that have most diseases. It's a diverse group of people. So we want to make sure that rare diseases are included, and we are supported by the organization.
Absolutely. So can you tell me a little bit about your experience kind of talking about this legislation with your colleagues on your side of the aisle, within your caucus, also outside of your caucus? Like, how has that process gone for you? Have you gotten any pushback?
I have some gray hair from my staff has done a really great job. We have support. In fact, we just found out we have a Senate co-sponsor. We can't do the reveal yet.
Are you sure?
Yeah. Rachel will kill me.
Yeah.
And we have, it's been a little tough on the other side of the aisle. I think we have one, or did we get the other one? I know.
We have one, we have a few in progress.
Right, you're right. And sometimes it seems like I don't want to put one broad brush on everybody, but sometimes the word diversity and what that means, that tends to scare some of my colleagues on the other side of the aisle off, or they feel like we're putting, government's putting their nose in something a little bit too much. But, we have support, on the Democratic side of the aisle. And also, we started within Energy and Commerce. We have a healthcare disparities group, a side group, and which is made up of a lot of different members on the Democratic side. And so they're very understanding and know that we have to do more to deal with healthcare inequities.
So I just wanted to give you a chance to talk about kind of the momentum in this moment for diversity in clinical trials, both on the NIH side, which you're leading, but there's also been conversations about this on the FDA side. Can you explain kind of this groundswell of support? Did it come from COVID? And I just was curious if you had any insight as to where that started.
I think COVID, and then there's been a lot before. 6 years ago, I would say, I didn't know we had such a maternal mortality crisis in this country. I was blown away. Someone from my district called me and said, hey, would you speak to this person? And spoke to the person, and that's how we found out. So I just think, thanks to reporters and news and journalists, that more of this information is getting out. So I just think it's a combination of things. Yes, I think it's COVID. I think what's happening with maternal mortality and other things, too, that people are becoming more aware of, even, with COVID, even with mental health, that has stemmed, we're talking about that a lot more because of COVID. So I just think it's a combination of things. And it could be, even people coming into Congress. We're getting more and more diverse as with each election. And I know on the Democratic side, this is the most diverse House of Democrats we've ever had. And I think, that influences, what you discuss at the table and what's accepted.
Absolutely. So can you tell us a little bit about prospects for your bill? So, there's like a CR, hopefully at the end of the month, to keep the government funded.
We have an election in November, there will be a CR. Nobody's going to
Yes,
see the government
exactly.
shut down.
So, there's a train leaving the station there. Hopefully there's a train leaving the station maybe in December as well, is kind of what that's looking like. So I just wanted to ask prospects, if you have any sense of what options might be for this to move forward.
I'm an optimist, or I couldn't be in this job, but we're hopeful, but not counting on the bill passing, by December. We're thinking that we are going to have to take it into the new year, but, you never know. Maybe there's something it can be attached to, or we have some extra time because we didn't get the CR done quite yet. So, but we're thinking it will probably be next year, but hopefully early next year.
Rachel, we have a quick audience question right here.
Incredible.
Hi, my name is Heidi Ross. I'm the Vice President of Policy and Regulatory Affairs for the National Organization for Rare Disorders, and in full disclosure, have endorsed your boss's, your bill. And just want to say that I think one of the most exciting aspects to us as a rare disease advocacy organization is the efforts around increasing diversity in the public education campaign. We know that in rare disease research, it's really hard to recruit clinical trial participants, and the idea of thinking creatively about how to engage those communities, I think, really benefits us writ large. So I wanted to ask you if you have any more details about what you're envisioning that would be, about how that outreach is going to be able to draw in those populations that are really tough to reach in the rare disease community.
Because COVID is such a good example with, we need trusted messengers, and whether that's, from churches or neighborhood groups and things like that, we need diverse, trusted messengers. That's helped. I know I visited in my district when we were trying to get people to get tested, and we had trusted messengers going out into the neighborhoods and going to churches or places of worship. And I think we have to follow that same pattern. And then also, it'd be good if at least some of the providers could also be people of color, because, that's an issue too, that, people feel more comfortable because there have been issues of, mistrust and among many people.
Rachel, one more audience question right over here.
Excellent.
So my name is Yasmin Long. I'm a director at Faster Cures, which is a center of the Milken Institute. I lead our health equity and diversity in clinical trials work. Thank you, Congresswoman, for the work that you do. We supported and endorsed that bill of the NIH Clinical Trial Diversity Act, and also work considerably with Anna Eschew's team, which was the former DePICT Act. So the reason I bring that up is because everything you're saying is so on point, and I think that there are so many things that we forget about when we're talking about this issue, and that's accountability, right? How are organizations going to be accountable for ensuring this is going to maintain? That includes the investments. That includes the return on investments for organizations, and I think we forget about that, as well as the value of community engagement. So I just want to say thank you for what you do. We endorse it, and we are working very hard to make sure that this issue is achieved using a multi-stakeholder approach. That includes patient advocates, federal agencies, philanthropy, funders, disease-specific organizations, contract research organizations, and of course the academic community. And that's the work that we do, and we support you very much, and thank you for being here. Yes. No, it was just the comment, sorry. That's it, thank you.
I do appreciate that.
We're going to have to call
We
you
hope for
over when the
questions.
bill passes to help us.
Rachel, we're tossing it back to you.
Okay, excellent. So I think the accountability question is a good one. And I'm just curious, in kind of outreach in developing this legislation, what did you hear from the people who might actually be conducting these trials? Was there any feedback that you incorporated to ensure that it was realistic and doable for them?
Well, I think we hear, it's so hard to, as I said, recruit people. So really making sure that people have developed a clear and concise way to recruit people. What are you going to do? You know, what are your metrics? Those who are you working with, like that young lady, to help, you know, to help you reach those goals. And then with retention, the same thing. What are the goals? You know, how are you going to retain people? Are you going to hire more people to help that have this experience? You know, diversity and inclusion, it just cannot be the same old, same way. And then I think we need to have, you know, evaluations, like not just say, okay, we have the rules and go at it. We need to make sure there's checks and balances as these trials are starting, in the middle, and ending.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much for your time. I think we're just about to the end of this panel. This is a very important conversation. It's a sea change. Certainly something we're going to be hearing a lot about in the future. So thanks so much.
And just an ending thing, you know, I have a great staff. We don't have all the answers. So, I mean, if you guys have ideas, please, you know, Robin Kelly, I'm in Rayburn, contact our office if you have ideas or experiences you want to share. So, thank you.
All right. Thanks so much.
Rachel, Congresswoman Kelly, thank you so much for that great discussion. And if you all are interested in diversity in clinical trials, my colleague Angus Chen has done a fantastic job covering this area, as well as it's one of the topics that we cover at the podcast that I host, Color Code, as well. So next, I would like to introduce, for a sponsored discussion, Sharon Barr, who's Senior Vice President, Head of Research and Product Development at Alexion, AstraZeneca Rare Disease, and Del LaBelle, coming back to the stage, and he is the Head of U.S. Government Affairs and Policy at Alexion, AstraZeneca Rare Disease.
Hello again, and thank you, Sharon. Welcome. As everyone heard, Sharon is our head of product development and research. In other words, she's brilliant. I'm not a scientist, and so she is. And every time I hear her talk, I marvel and hearing her talk about the science. Sharon, do you want to tell a little bit about yourself before we move into a discussion about some of the rare disease considerations from an R&D standpoint and a manufacturer standpoint?
Yeah, I'd love to. So I was introduced as the head of research and product development at Alexion AstraZeneca Rare Disease, and that is what it says on my business card. But what I really am is a scientist who absolutely loves to follow the science to create new therapeutics for people who need them. I'm also a mother, and it so happens that my two children were each diagnosed with a different rare disease. And that's not that surprising because rare disease isn't rare. In the United States alone, there's probably 30 million people, about 1 in 10, who suffer from rare diseases. So it's not terribly shocking that it would have happened twice in my family. And I am lucky enough that I'm fluent in the language of science and rare disease. So it made it maybe a little more navigable for me. But it also gave me a profound understanding of what families are experiencing as they walk through this journey. And it makes my job ever so much more meaningful to me. And so what I often reflect on with my job is that we need to follow the science to create these new therapeutics for people who have no viable therapy. But it takes more than science. It actually takes all of us. It takes a community. It takes the scientists and the clinicians and the academic experts and the patient advocacy organizations and the regulators and the policymakers and the payers and the voices throughout this organization that all help us to coordinate our efforts to bring a good idea all the way to a patient's doorstep. So it takes the coordinated efforts of all of us and not just any one part of us. And I'm really pleased to be a part of that.
That's great. Maybe you could share your perspective on what some people might not necessarily know about the challenges of R&D for rare disease.
Yeah, sometimes I joke with my staff that science is hard. But the truth is that rare disease research is especially challenging, and here's why. I didn't always work in rare disease, and when I when I think about, how I moved from being a basic science researcher to an oncology researcher to a rare disease researcher, what makes rare disease especially challenging is we often don't really understand the biology of a disease. We don't have the cellular systems and the animal models to really investigate that rare disease. We often don't know very much about the biomarkers for those diseases, so we have to figure it out all for ourselves from the ground up. We have to build a really huge knowledge base to be able to begin to make that therapeutic and to understand how it's working in patients. So that's what makes it challenging from the perspective of a scientist. It's also what makes it really interesting and really satisfying when we're successful.
That's really interesting perspective. Thinking about the challenges that we need to address, from the diagnostic odyssey to people really understanding the value of rare disease medicines. What would you have to offer in that regard?
Yeah, so, Del, I think you wisely mentioned in your introduction that one of the hardest things for patients with rare disease is getting the right diagnosis. We heard from the speaker in his video in the beginning how long he lived with that disease before he knew what it was and before he could get to a therapeutic. So as Del mentioned, we know that on average it takes 4.8 years for a patient to get to the right diagnosis. And during that time, they'll see at least 7 different specialists. And as they go through that odyssey, they'll often get the wrong diagnosis and then the wrong therapeutic. And some of the tests that they undergo are very difficult. As a parent, I can tell you that this exactly reflects the journey that we faced with one of our children. And so we realized that if what we want to do is create better therapies for patients, the first thing that we have to do is create better diagnostics to get them to those therapies faster. So part of what we do in my group at Alexion is make new medicines. Another part of what we do is make new diagnostic tests. And we place those in the community. Our goal is to make them available to patients so they can get the answers that they need. Whether or not it's a therapy that we can provide, we want them to get the answers that they need faster. And again, that's a coordinated effort. This is something that we as a rare disease community have to collaborate to make possible for patients.
What is your idea of what maybe could be better, could be more, could be different from a regulatory or an FDA standpoint?
So many things. So, I think one thing that's really wonderful about working in rare disease is the open dialogue that we have with regulators. We meet with the regulatory authorities as they advise us early and often, and we work collaboratively with them. Could we design a trial that looks like this? Would this make sense to you? And they'll give us feedback and sage advice. We often meet with them before ever designing a clinical trial for scientific advice, and we find that interaction to be very helpful. So I appreciate that. But when we think about how we progress through the regulatory pathway, I wonder if there's some things that we might do collaboratively that would really help patients get to those therapies that they need faster. And I have a couple ideas that I'll put on the table, and then we can explore a bit more. One of those ideas is that we need to create a knowledge base that really lives in the pre-competitive space. We did that really well for oncology. We have huge databases of genetic variants in tumors. We have huge cell line banks that we can share freely. It's a ton of information that's broadly available to researchers in oncology. We haven't established that for rare disease. And so it would be really wonderful if we could set up that freeware for the rare disease patient community to accelerate research. When we move things into clinical trials, I wonder if we might learn from what we did in oncology and think about conditional approval so that we can get those patients to therapy faster, and then do that follow-up and continue to track those patients and all of the data before being granted full approval. I think that's something that we might consider as a path that would bring therapies to small numbers of patients faster.
That's a great perspective. Thinking about, two areas where we've done very well, from rare disease policy, the Orphan Drug Act. Prior to the Orphan Drug Act, we had a handful of drugs, quite frankly, in the rare disease space. Since then, we've had upwards to 1,000. We have the accelerated approval pathway, which is so meaningful, which you could potentially speak to what that pathway means and what it's all about and how significant these two examples that I'm talking about right now and what it means to rare disease.
Yeah, so accelerated approval is incredibly valuable to research and drug developers in rare disease. Some of the things that we work on collaboratively are, for example, surrogate endpoints. So the NIH defines that as a biomarker which can be used as a readout for clinical activity. And often in rare disease, we don't know what the right surrogate endpoints are. So again, that's a collaboration with regulatory authorities where we propose what we know about biomarkers and ask whether or not that might be considered something that would be sufficiently valuable to gauge a patient's success. So I really appreciate that ongoing dialogue that we have with regulators.
We've heard various comments tonight about the challenges of clinical trials, recruitment. Maybe you could speak to and share with everyone here the specific challenges for rare disease in that regard.
Yeah, so enrolling for a trial in rare disease is exceptionally challenging because rare disease is rare. We have to go find those patients where they live. And so we might enroll sites all over the world that never see a patient. We have to enroll more sites than we expect to enroll patients, which is incredibly expensive and time-consuming to do. In round numbers, comparing to previous experience in oncology, we run per patient cost at about 10 times that in rare disease. So we have to put a significant investment of time and resources into setting up the sites that we need to recruit the patients to be able to gather the data for a clinical trial. So that's one of the significant challenges, finding those patients and setting up sites in a place where those patients can participate in our trial.
Thanks. We've touched on a lot. I think we're about at time, so we'll come to a conclusion. I think your comments speak to really just a plethora of challenges that we have to address in this space. Thank you, Sharon, and I'll now turn it over to Nick for the next session.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Stella and Sharon. Yes. Now, to kick off our next session, I'd like to share another pre-recorded video featuring Dr. J. Scott Randall. Now, Dr. J. Scott Randall is a Barth syndrome patient advocate. Jay has 2 sons with Barth syndrome, and he's here to share his story about and their experiences and just all that entails for him as a parent. I just want to give a thank you to Jay for sharing his story. And we're all just so happy that his kids are doing better. Now, to continue this discussion, I'd like to welcome to the stage Rini McCarthy, who is CEO at Stealth Biotherapeutics, Frank Sazanowski, Director at Hyman, Phelps, and McNamara, and to moderate this session, the man himself, Ed Silverman, Pharmalot columnist and senior writer at STAT. And again, if you have questions, feel free to flag me down. I'll be going around with a microphone. And please keep them to questions as we are short for time. Thank you so much.
Mine's on.
No, you're fine.
You're okay. Is yours working?
I don't know. Is it working?
Here, you can use this one for now. Gotcha. Yeah.
Okay. Nice to see everybody. Thank you for coming out tonight. We appreciate it. Rini and Frank, thank you for being here. You saw two testimonials about Barth's syndrome from different perspectives. The purpose of this panel is to flesh that out a little bit. Obviously, there's a backstory behind the medicine that those two folks talked about. And what I want to do is use this session as an opportunity to talk about the process, not to beat up on FDA, but to learn about what one company has experienced trying to get its drug across the finish line, and to provide some context on the regulatory issues, which of course is where Frank comes in. So, Rini, I want to start with you. Let's go back a little bit in time briefly and tell us how your company came to a drug for Barth syndrome in the first place, given that it is an ultra-rare disease.
Yeah, so we are developing drugs for mitochondrial dysfunction, and our drug is targeting a phospholipid that's often dysfunctional in mitochondrial disease. It's actually, is this better? It's not working? I'll just talk louder if you want.
Try that one.
Okay, so, wow, that's really working. So our drug targets this phospholipid that's often dysfunctional in mitochondrial disease. In Barth syndrome, the genetic defect is actually a defect in an enzyme that is part of the building block of this phospholipid. So really with that, the disease is like fatal. 85% of the children die by the age of 5, and Jay touched on that a little. They go into acute heart failure. If they survive early infancy, they can live like Walker did, a very diminished life, typically until their 3rd or 4th decade, when they also die from heart failure. And within that, adolescence is also very, very challenging because of high metabolic stress. How did we get into this disease? We were a private company. We were approached by a researcher at Johns Hopkins, which is one of only 2 centers worldwide treating Barth syndrome. The disease affects less than 300 people worldwide, so it's really, really rare. And we were also approached by the Barth Syndrome Foundation. And we thought, well, we can do a small trial. This is not going to be an expensive endeavor. We can try it. We were looking at other rare diseases. This could potentially be label expansion. That's how we got into Barth syndrome. There were a lot of lessons learned after that, though.
Well, let's start talking about some of those lessons. Give us a quick timeline as you walk us through the first steps in trying to develop the drug, and importantly, interacting with FDA, and the extent to which FDA helped you along in your thinking about which directions to go.
Sure. So, I mean, our drug had been discovered in 2006. By the time Barth Syndrome Foundation came to us, it was 2014. So we had done a lot of phase 1 work. We had pretty well characterized the safety of the drug. And we had another program in another mitochondrial disease where we had a lot of regulatory guidance. So we kind of mimicked that program in designing the Barth syndrome trial. Because the disease is so rare, we did it as a crossover trial. So with that, you can kind of use patients as their own control, but there are also risks of doing that. And we studied it in essentially a 3-month treatment period, which was too short. And those are some of the lessons learned. Unfortunately, in Barth syndrome, you kind of only get one chance to learn those lessons because it's very hard to do another trial. So we started the trial in 2017. We read out on data in late 2018, didn't hit the primaries in the 3-month treatment period, But going into our first FDA meeting in 2019, we were seeing statistically significant improvements in open label extension. And there's lots of problems with that, as we all know, because it's not controlled data. So in 2018, the Division of Neurology said, we think you should gather more data, and then they moved us over to the Division of Gastroenterology, which then in 2020 reorganized into the Division of Rare Disease and Medical Genetics, and today we sit in the Division of Cardiology. So within a few years, we've actually interacted with 4 divisions at the FDA. There's been discussion along the way about doing another clinical trial pre-approval. Again, there's just really not a lot of patients. And when we talk about potential regulatory flexibility, we end up with scenarios that would see us, recruiting almost 40% of the US patient population in a pre-approval trial, and we've already used most of those patients. So it's just not really feasible. We've done natural history studies following FDA guidance, but there's challenges with that because, again, these are many of them effort-dependent endpoints. So I think that we've had a really good dialogue with FDA, but there's you can't get there from here in terms of the relative rigor and robustness of what you would want to do in a clinical trial when you're talking about a patient population that numbers in the low hundreds.
Frank, I want to ask you, in your experience, how many companies encounter this sort of situation Rini described where they're bouncing from division to division? And what do you think, from talking to the folks you know at these companies, what do you think that has done to the odds of successfully getting approval?
Well, thanks, Ed. But the bouncing around was very unusual. I think that, I've probably had a hand in more rare disease therapies and more meetings at the FDA with rare diseases than anyone. And so I've seen a lot. And this is very unusual in terms of the bouncing around. But what's not unusual is having a patient population that is very small, having a patient population, you heard Dr. Barr earlier describe some of the problems you have with rare diseases in general, where it's very difficult. You don't have animal models, so you can't test it. What does the FDA always say to you? Well, when you come along, how are you going to do dose optimization? Well, wait a minute, you only have a few hundred patients in the world. I can't waste them on doing dose selection. I can't validate endpoints, measurement tools that will allow us to say that this is a measurement tool that is validated for this patient population. So you have to try to cannibalize other tools that were developed for other diseases, which may not be that applicable. So what's more common, Ed, than the question about bouncing? Bouncing doesn't happen that often. But what is common is all the other problems that make it unbelievably difficult, and it's very courageous for the patients and for the patient advocacy groups and for the companies and the academics like Dr. Hilary Vernon in Hopkins to all try to focus on these rare diseases. It's a remarkable, heroic effort that people are putting out. And so we can talk about where we go from here.
Well, before we figure out the future, I just want to ask you to bring up to date a little bit on where you are right now. And you're currently in which division?
We're in the Division of Cardiology, and we actually asked for that consult, so that switch was on us.
And how long have you been dealing with that?
So it's been 2 years now, almost. We had actually been told that about a year and a half ago that the division was encouraging us to submit an NDA for elamipretide, but then 2 weeks before NDA submission, they said they had changed their mind and they wanted another trial. So we actually, at that point, submitted because, again, we don't think we can do another pre-approval trial. We received a refusal to file. We continued discussions with the agency, and during that period, we actually closed out the open label extension. So these patients, and you've seen some of them, have been on drug now for 4 years. And one of the agency's concerns, right, with the data and the natural history controls and everything else was that we didn't have objective endpoints that were moving, other than this biomarker specific to the disease, which is the ratio of abnormal cardiolipin, which was significantly improved. But after 4 years on therapy, when we closed out the trial, we did see 40% improvement in left ventricular stroke volume, mean improvement in the patients left in, as well as improvements in end diastolic volume, which was pretty meaningful because these patients were essentially presenting between the ages of 12 and 31 in congestive heart failure, very close to cardiogenic shock in terms of their cardiac output. So those improvements in stroke volume and end diastolic volume probably do contribute to the improvements in exercise reported by patients. So we now have an objective endpoint. Unfortunately, it's still an open label objective endpoint, and it took 4 years for us to get there. So I think that's where we are with the agency is, could the accelerated approval process have the flexibility inherent in it in this ultra-rare disease where you could take an objective finding like that and require a post-marketing trial rather than a pre-marketing trial. But we haven't crossed the line yet.
What do you think of that possibility?
Well, I think that where we've gone, people who don't know, I happen to have been at FDA, helped implement the Orphan Drug Act, and so I've been at this for a long, long time. And I think the stumbling block is always I hate to say this as a lawyer, but it's the legal standard. It's the legal standard of substantial evidence of effectiveness. If you heard in the advisory committee last Wednesday, on September 7th, for Amylyx's ALS drug, you would have heard the FDA explain carefully what the legal standard is. That the legal standard is usually met by 2 adequate and well-controlled studies, which is the historic way. And then in 1998, the FDA said, well, sometimes it can be with 1 highly persuasive statistical study if the endpoint is irreversible morbidity and mortality, which is almost never going to happen. Or in 1997, the Congress added an amendment that said it could sometimes be 1 adequate and well-controlled positive study, which is a conventional p-value of less than 0.05 with confirmatory evidence. The FDA never defined confirmatory evidence. So the law was passed in 97. The first time the FDA tried to define it was in December 2019, so 22 years later. It's very hard. That's what I'm saying. And so when you heard the FDA officials at their advisory committee last Wednesday walk through this, it sets up an unbelievably steep hill for people to climb. Because what it's telling the advisory community is that, hey, look, normally we expect 2 adequate and well-controlled studies. So we're doing people a favor to even be listening to this company because they only have 1 study. And then these are the 2 ways that you can do it with the 1 study, but they're very difficult to get to. I mean, one case, so we depend upon something called flexibility, and it's something that Dr. Dunn explained in great care last Wednesday, and I was buoyed to hear him do that. It was fantastic. I hate to say this, I know Rachel's here from NORD. When I was chairman of the board of NORD, I authored a paper that's sometimes called the NORD paper, but it was a 2011 paper. The front page quoted exactly what Dr. Dunn said. So now, after listening to me, people can now listen to Dr. Dunn. So thank God. But but here's the problem. When the FDA finally articulated clearly how to implement flexibility in the conduct of how do you apply science to this legal standard, it's still left to the vagaries of the individual. And I have had situations where I've been asked to chair panels, and I've had people from the FDA come sit on the panel, and I'll say, your division was very important for approving this drug, and they set standards for looking at how you can use external natural history, or how you can, very creative activities out of your division. The world would like to know how you did that. And I've had the FDA people tell me, well, that was my predecessor. I won't speak publicly about that, which is a way to say, that was their choice, not my choice, and I wouldn't endorse that. So there's a problem when we talk about flexibility that you're left to the idiosyncrasy, the ad hoc nature of who is going to be making the decision at the time. So I think we need to get where Dr. Barr was going and saying about conditional approval like they have in Europe. Or what we heard Dr. Peter Marks just say this week, he talked about learning from COVID. Peter Marks headed the Center for Biologics, and so he had a major hand in all the COVID vaccines, and he's now trying to figure out how can we build on what we learned from COVID. And one of the things I would suggest that we learn is that in the difficult to treat areas, like when you have an ultra rare disease, we look at the EUA standard, the emergency authorization. And so we look at that, because that legal standard isn't substantial evidence of effectiveness. That standard for getting authorization is whether or not the known and potential benefits outweigh the known and potential risks. So it's going to be far easier.
Yeah.
So if we could have a conditional approval like they have in Europe, or we have a different standard like maybe we learned from COVID, and we have a pilot project, maybe just in ultra orphans, so that it's not going to be too scary for policymakers to reach out. So this for ultra orphans. Let's try to have a pilot program at the FDA in which the basis would be an emergency use authorization.
Ed, we have a question here in the back.
I published a first opinion essay a few weeks ago by a guy named William Woods, a pediatric cancer researcher in Philadelphia. And he couldn't say enough about the FDA's cancer group, that they were flexible, that they were able to turn on a dime and make a new standard when a new drug showed a very small benefit. He was diagnosed with ALS 3 years ago, and it just can't understand the difference between the FDA's cancer group and its neurosciences group. So you're talking about sort of where your drug or where your disease gets put in FDA. We think of the FDA as being kind of monolithic, but it's not. Can you talk about that?
It's not. It's definitely not. I mean, we were in neurology, we've been in rare disease, we're in cardiology. I would say I've heard from scientists and head of the office, head of the division in cardiology, just to the points we're talking, they need different approval standards because they're wary of making ad hoc exceptions. Oncology has done it and then has followed a precedence within that division that they've held true to. But elsewhere where you see flexibility applied, it's kind of one decision and then maybe a retrenching away from it because of political backlash or public backlash or sponsors not doing what they said they would do for their accelerated approval commitments. There's reasons the FDA is wary of making these kinds of exceptions, but we've heard pretty clearly, like, we would like to be able to look at risk versus benefit. We would love a conditional approval pathway. We don't have the authority for that, and we're concerned about setting a precedent for that. Again, oncology has been quite different.
So I had talked to someone at FDA at the cardiology division, and I said, well, what about flexibility? What about looking at other ideas? And he mentioned the animal rule. You had mentioned that, Frank. Perhaps you could tell folks very quickly what the animal rule is, why that's coming up, can actually go anywhere, because it's not like you can snap your fingers and say, yeah, let's try that.
The animal rule came up in response to the 9/11. We're right in the kind of in the shadows of 9/11. And after 9/11, the FDA was looking for ways that it could approve things for bioterrorism, like a dirty bomb, or even if they were going to weaponize anthrax and use that. And so in order to have therapies available for the American public and to stockpile them, we had to come up with a way to approve them so that they could be put into a stockpile. You can't put an investigational therapy into a stockpile. So the FDA came up with the animal rule. But the animal rule is specifically just for things that are so dangerous that they couldn't be studied in clinical trials. So there's a part of the preamble to the animal rule that kind of closes it off from us having access to it. But the intellectual construct of it, that therefore, if you can show this in an animal model, and it's very convincing in an animal model, well, if in the case of a situation like Barth, where you're not going to be able to develop a Barth-specific instrument that's going to measure the pharmacological benefit of your therapy, it's just not possible, and you don't have enough people, can we apply that? Well, legally, you might not be able to apply it now, and that's why it's going to call for some modification of the law. That's why whether it's talking about a conditional approval program like they have in Europe, or using what Dr. Marks was suggesting, that we do lessons learned from COVID. Maybe we use the EUA as a pilot project, or we use the animal rule. But it's going to take a little bit of, I think it would need some other authority to be able to apply those. It's just not available now. The only thing we have available now is flexibility. And it was a concept that I floated, in that paper in 2011, and I showed how the FDA had done it. But to your point, when Dr. Temple, a very good friend of mine, senior guy at the FDA, who's only been there about 50 years, that I'm very, very good friends with Bob. And so when I ran by him, what I intended to do my analysis of every single new chemical entity FDA had approved from the day Ronald Reagan signed the Orphan Drug Act in January '83 through June 2010, when I testified before FDA in their first public hearing. And I said, we need to know what is the basis. And Bob Temple, when I told him I was going to look at these 135 drugs, he said, yeah, only look at those 135 which are not for rare cancers, because cancer inside the FDA is entirely different. It's treated entirely different. So so don't contaminate your analysis, Frank, by trying to conflate what they do with rare cancers with what they do with other rare diseases.
I guess I would say one other thing on the animal rule, because I talked to the individual I think that you chatted with about that. It came up because of his perception that it is just as unethical in the setting of rare disease to require multiple clinical trials, because you really can't get to the statistical standards that those trials are intended to address. So again, it's just another example, I think, of FDA looking for a path that was thrown out.
So you're a small company, and you're focusing in part on this hard-to-treat disease, and it's taking forever, and you're still not sure where it's going. What does that do to the perception of the company? And we all know that investors, whether it's VC or the street, they're going to look askance at companies with low odds. But could you explain a little bit just what this has actually been like, and where you think you're headed despite some of the hurdles you've encountered?
Sure. I mean, from an investment thesis perspective, it's a bit of a disaster, frankly, to be in this situation. We had, a year where we were told again that we could proceed with an NDA, and then told 2 weeks before submission that it wouldn't be accepted and we should, take another path. So when you're sort of flip-flopping publicly as a public company, and we're about, we've received a go private offer, so we do have the benefit of a long-term, backer who really believes in the science, but that was pretty brutal for us. And I think that you try to balance your commitment to a patient population and your belief in what you're seeing in the data with like what you can reasonably expect investors to finance. So, we literally can't afford another clinical trial, because who's going to write that check? The return on investment for a disease this rare is next to nil. We do have rare pediatric designation, which brings the potential for a voucher, which is kind of like the one silver lining. But I would say that investors, you're kind of like the boy who cried wolf, right? You keep saying, well, we think there's this pathway or this, or the FDA has said we could do that, and then they change their mind. The NDA filing wasn't the only situation where we've had advice sort of walked back. And so, again, our approach with this particular disease is what can we do creatively that's more about sweat equity and natural history studies and regulatory discussions than it is being able to write big checks to do additional trials. We just can't do it.
Any questions? Because we're getting near the end of the session. No? Okay.
I just want to say that, I've been at this for like 40 years, working at these rare diseases. And when I find companies, like Reni's companies and her commitment, or Alexion, I can start talking about what like Martine Zimmerman has done with some things like for Wilson's disease. It's heroic. It is heroic. You're asking about investors. It's heroic. So my hat's off to all the people who are in the trenches, know that there are some people here in Washington, like NORD, the Every Life Foundation for Rare Diseases, who are working as hard as we can on behalf of patients to support you, because the work you do is great. Thanks.
Ed, we have one audience question over here.
Thank you. Rini, just very interesting response. How many firms or organizations are a part of your sort of catchment area where they're running it across or into a brick wall almost with some of the funding, et cetera?
I mean, we've been really lucky again because we do have a long-term investor who's been really supportive of the science, and we have other programs and other compounds. I would say the companies where often it's small biotechs that kind of tilt at these windmills, and if you run into these challenges, you go out of business for the most part. So I think, diseases like this can be great opportunities if you can get it across the line. I mean, Sarepta with Duchenne is an example that I think almost died on that hill and didn't. But for the others, there's half dozen, Frank, and usually they crash and burn. It doesn't work. So it's challenging.
Well, thank you, everyone. Rini, Frank, thank you very much for being here tonight. We appreciate it.
I just want to say thank you again to Ed, Rini, and Frank. That was a terrific session. For our next and final session, I'd like to welcome to the stage Holly Fernandez Lynch, who is an assistant professor of medical ethics and law at the University of Pennsylvania, David Stewary, who is the legislative assistant for Congressman Mike Quigley, Tim Tobin, who is an ALS advocate and a man who lives with ALS, and to moderate the session, one of our newest reporters, Sarah Overmall, who is a Washington correspondent at STAT and who has been hitting the ground running ever since she joined a few weeks ago. She's on fire.
Thank you for that, Nick. And thank you all for staying for this session. It's going to be really interesting based on my earlier conversations. And I think that the last session really set up well for this. I was worried they were going to take all of our questions. But I want to start with you, David. The Act for ALS Act was passed into law in December, so it's been roughly 9 months. Of course, you work for its main sponsor. That provided research grants for ALS, also instructed FDA to make a 5-year action plan. So in those 9 months, what has happened and what hasn't?
Thanks, Sarah. That's a really good question. So this is actually a really exciting month for Act for ALS. As a lot of you might have seen yesterday, FDA and the Critical Path Institute announced their public-private partnership for rare neurodegenerative disease, including ALS. That was mandated by Section 3, and we're over the moon to see that coming several months ahead of schedule, actually. In addition to that, we know that NIH has solicited grant applications for its expanded access programs under Act for ALS, and we're so thrilled about that. It's 90% of ALS patients are not part of the research infrastructure, are not being studied, and what these expanded access programs are going to do is open that up and help researchers study a broader cross section of folks that are living with ALS, as well as provide just earlier access to promising therapeutics. So we expect those grants to be announced pretty much any day now. Sometime NIH has said that it's going to be before the end of the fiscal year, which is about 2 weeks away. So, so we're thrilled about that. And I'd also be remiss if I didn't mention the fantastic Rare Neurodegenerative Disease Action Plan that FDA put out. So they put that out back in June, that lays out exactly what FDA is going to do for ALS in the next 5 years. And so the things that are just so exciting to us are the fact that they're focusing on decentralized trials. They're focusing on expanding who is going to be able to enroll here, and making sure that it's not just you live in Boston, and so you're very, very lucky to have access to clinical trials, but make sure that it's everybody who's going to be able to have access to clinical trials and to expanded access.
So that's all the positives, everything that has happened. Is there anything that you're waiting on? Or I know, there's a question of continuing the funding as well.
Yeah, so of course we're waiting to hear from NIH of which expanded access programs they're going to fund. So waiting with bated breath there, and yeah, we're working very hard on figuring out what the next steps are in terms of funding. So we're thrilled that in the House's fiscal year 23 labor HHS appropriations bill, we got the full funding amount of $75 million for the expanded access research programs, as well as an additional $5 million for FDA and the orphan drug grant program. So we're working to make sure that that we can actually get those gains. It's a long road ahead. I think heard pretty much everybody talking about the CR that's coming down the line, which of course is gonna not have those gains. But we'll, we're working hard with our colleagues in the House and in the Senate to make sure that NIH and FDA are going to have the funding they need to get this across the finish line.
Tim, the last panel brought up Amylyx's therapy and what happened this month with the 7-2 vote, but there was a negative vote in March. And I wrote down actually what Frank said about, quote, vagaries of the individual. So how do you think the conversation has changed around ALS therapies and what should be considered, and was it vagaries of the individual?
Well, I think that so first I want to thank Representative Quigley for Act for ALS and the support he's had for the ALS community, so that's been really great. Act for ALS is a great piece of legislation, and it does expand access to investigational drugs, it has more research dollars, but it really didn't impact the approval pathways at all through the FDA. And I think there was a lot to take away from the Amylyx AdCom. As we heard from the prior panel, it was really great to hear Dr. Dunn talk about regulatory flexibility, especially in the context of a disease like ALS, where there's a substantial unmet need. So it's excellent that that's the focus that they're moving towards, but I don't think the FDA has moved that quickly or efficiently over time. It's great to hear those words, but we need to see more and more action. And I think that there's a lot that goes into that. So, the history, we've heard the prior speaker talk about, traditionally you needed 2 complete trials, and so we need more flexibility, and we need that regulatory flexibility to be put in place in practice. And for example, with Amylyx, the FDA's position is that the additional evidence really didn't change the equation that much, but there was just much more emphasis on the regulatory flexibility. In my mind, that means there probably was enough evidence back in March, notwithstanding the AdCom vote, to go ahead and approve the drug based on this regulatory flexibility concept that Dr. Dunn was pushing so hard last week. So that's the kind of thing we'd want to see. 6 months or more has passed in the intervening time, and people in my position, continue to decline, and people have continued to die. So we need more urgency from the agency, and we need them to demonstrate that they're going to provide that flexibility. And we need them to provide the flexibility so that we send a message to industry that, yeah, you can come in and file for approval, because we are going to use flexibility here. I think far too often, certain companies might want to stay away, or they want to wait until they have more perfect evidence. We can't wait for that, so we need more urgent action.
Holly, regulatory flexibility. It's a fine balancing act between making sure that these therapies come, like Tim said, to people who, are in dire need of something, but also ensuring that there is, in fact, a benefit. So how does FDA walk that line? Because there have been times that has backfired with other disease areas as well.
Yeah, I joked with you when we were standing in the back that I might be the one to rain on this parade a little bit. We do have a conditional approval pathway in the U.S. It's called accelerated approval, right? So a pathway that allows you to get your product on the market before we're sure that it works, and then we expect companies to prove it later. Accelerated approval doesn't work for every disease area. Obviously, it's not something that we've seen used in ALS or some other disease areas, so it may not be a perfect pathway, that will hit every target that we are hoping to find, to meet an unmet need. But it does give us kind of a good glimpse of what happens when we don't force companies to prove that their products work, which is that the market incentives change pretty dramatically. You get your product on the market, you tell people this is how much we want you to pay, and we expect you to pay, and we're not willing to give you a discount because we haven't yet proved that it works. There's an incentive to drag your feet in getting those trials done. We know that FDA has a hard time pulling products off the market, even when companies don't finish their trials or have a difficult time designing them in a rigorous way. The incentives for patients to participate in those trials change pretty dramatically. Why would you participate in a randomized study if your clinician will prescribe the drug and the payers will pay for it? So I think that's a big gap in this conversation that we've been having. If you haven't proven that your drug works, you probably shouldn't be paying full price for it. And, we're starting to see a bit of movement in that direction, but it is baby steps. So I don't mean to, be the person up here saying, FDA's got it right. I see a lot of problems and concerns about how FDA is applying these standards in a different way across the agency, for different diseases. But I'd like to emphasize that, as the Act for ALS has, access doesn't only have to come through the approval pathways. So we can expand access to clinical trials. For people who can't participate in clinical trials, let's get them in expanded access programs. Really, what we have to ask is who's going to make sure that companies prove their drugs work? That has been FDA's job.
Right.
Could I just
Yeah,
jump in
absolutely.
for a quick second? I do have some concerns with the accelerated approval pathway for ALS specifically. So ironically, I think it was designed with the concept of a disease like ALS in mind, where you would have, a serious life-threatening condition and unmet need, but it's also where there's no, where you're not relying on a primary endpoint. I think there was an intention to be able to allow for surrogate endpoints to be used, which would be helpful in some cases, but for ALS, it's a heterogeneous disease without good biomarkers, and so it's hard to identify secondary endpoints, and so it doesn't really work as well as it should. And so I'm not convinced, Holly, that it is as effective a pathway as you might be suggesting.
No, I don't think it's a perfect pathway. My worry, though, is that as a pathway, we've seen that the incentives shift, right? It's supposed to be a trade. Companies get their product on the market quickly. That's a good thing for patients who don't have time to wait. And then they are expected to prove later. That back half of the equation in too many instances hasn't panned out. So companies are able to profit, right? And then they're not necessarily, giving the community, right, the patient community and payer communities the evidence to show that these products are worth it.
Yeah, and I don't really take issue with the back-end requirement to provide confirmatory evidence. I'm just not sure the pathway works well for ALS in the first place. And but I also do think that if we do get to the point of confirmatory evidence, there has to be a lot of regulatory flexibility there. Because as you mentioned, once a drug's approved, people living with ALS, for example, and in other rare diseases, they're not going to want to go into a traditional double-blinded placebo-controlled trial. They're going to want access to the drug that's been approved. So we need to be looking at, and I think the FDA has talked about it, but we need to be more focused on innovative ways to get the confirmatory evidence, real-world evidence, patient registries, maybe, and I wouldn't pretend to be an expert in this area, but finding ways where you can use control group from other trials or just innovative methods to get the confirmatory evidence.
We're going to get to what you just talked about placebo and all that, but just going back to what I feel is the elephant in the room as we talk about a price point for something that hasn't been quite proven yet, Aduhelm, the Alzheimer's medicine, David, I know that your boss, Representative Quigley, has thoughts about that as well. Do you feel that there's a place that Congress, a role Congress can play in this question?
Sorry.
I mean, Congress has a role wherever Congress says it has a role.
That's a good answer.
But perhaps it's. Thank you. I mean, I think that one of the bottom lines here is when we're talking about getting a drug to market. No, of course we shouldn't take cost into account. If either it works or it probably works or it doesn't, and from a regulatory standpoint, that's the question. But then it's from a payer standpoint whether you're going to just accept what's dictated. And I mean, perhaps Congress has a role to play there, but I think that I think everybody in this room would agree that there is a substantial need to incentivize companies to invest in these drugs. There's no, how do you say this? There are small patient populations. It's not like you're saying that you're going to pay for a drug for 1 million people. So I think that it's something that it really needs to be worked out with the payers, perhaps and thinking a lot about the demonstrated effectiveness. But when it comes to deciding whether or not you're going to just approve a drug, no, we should not be thinking about cost.
Well, going back to the idea of expanded access, as you talked about, and when people aren't in clinical trials, what is the trade-off with expanded access, and how can FDA, especially with ALS patients, have flexibility there?
So I think FDA has done pretty much everything in its power to make expanded access as easy to do as possible, right? So FDA is not the one that's saying no. They say yes to almost 100% of single patient expanded access requests. They say yes to a very high proportion of intermediate population and broader treatment protocols. But there are lots of other barriers in the pathway. So for example, I'm doing interviews with oncologists right now to ask them how do they decide whether to offer expanded access. And I'm talking with people who are at academic medical centers, very well resourced. And without exception, they say, it's a huge pain in the ass. It's something that, I don't get paid for. It's something that I have to do on top of my regular job. They also say without exception that if it's the right thing to do for the patient, they figure out how to do it. But they are relying on the clinical research infrastructure within their organization. So they're pulling their clinical research staff off of other funded projects for one patient at a time. And that's not an efficient process. They then take their requests on behalf of patients to companies. Companies often say yes, but they often say no, and they have good reasons in many cases to say no. They have a shortage in terms of manufacturing. Small companies might have insufficient staff to handle this. They have fairness concerns when there are some patients who are in the trial still receiving placebo. They have concerns about how FDA is going to handle any adverse events. There's all sorts of reasons for companies to say no, right? And it's just outside the usual pathway. So that's why I think this Act for ALS is a really innovative approach. I'm glad that it's something that's being piloted because it tries to get at a lot of those concerns. It offers funding for expanded access only to small companies, which I think is helpful to avoid a windfall for larger companies. And it allows a mechanism to gather data from patients who are using the products and their data would otherwise be lost. It provides funds for those sites, right, where the physicians are actually administering the drugs to be able to have the resources to go through this process. So I think it's a really great pathway. Really the concern, the only criticism I have is, why stop at ALS? I think the answer is, right, it's a pilot program. Let's see how it goes in that population, and then we can level up to other, rare diseases as well.
Yeah, Holly, I was going to interject and say exactly the same thing. You know, I read your article in Lancet and thought, wow, that's spot on. And so one thing I want to highlight from the bill is that we included an accountability provision. We are making sure that this program is being studied because I don't think it should really stop at ALS. I think that ALS is the poster child for where this sort of program is going to work, but it's not as though that ALS is the only disease where this can work. And so we're really excited to see what some of the results are in ALS and see how we can expand access to promising drugs in other disease areas as well.
And I would just say, Act for ALS is great, and I'm totally in favor of the expanded access provisions, but it doesn't affect the entire population. And so I just go back to, I think we do need the FDA to be acting with more urgency and flexibility. And if they're not able to, you know, the prior two panels, there were discussion about conditional approval. And so I do think that there needs to be a legislative push for conditional approval if the FDA is not going to show that they're going to, in practice, use that regulatory flexibility. And to that point, I would commend Representative Quigley again, because he co-sponsored the Promising Pathway Act, which is a conditional approval bill based on not substantial evidence of effectiveness, but promising evidence of effectiveness with confirmatory confirmatory data needing to be provided later, and it's time limited. So commend Representative Quigley for that. There was some bipartisan support. I don't think it's an very active bill at the moment, but I think that needs to be revisited if the FDA doesn't show its willingness to act urgently.
Yeah, talk about a place where Congress certainly has a role to play. So thanks for bringing up the Promising Pathway Act. I think that it provides at least a direction in which we can go. And one thing that talked about a lot tonight is the confirmatory evidence. And one thing that Promising Pathways has is just an automatic trigger for removing drugs from the market that are approved under that pathway. And if certain trial requirements aren't met, especially if trials just simply aren't happening, and when it comes to a conditional approval pathway, that's probably something that we need.
I will say about Promising Pathway, I've got a paper on that one
knew
too.
you were gonna chime in.
It's not as favorable as the one about Act for ALS. What I love about Promising Pathways is this idea of the automatic withdrawal provision. I think we need to take that out of FDA's hands. You don't do the studies. You can't keep your product on the market. What concerns me about Promising Pathways is that it, in every other respect, kind of doubles down on the accelerated approval pathway, which is its intention, but the language is very ambiguous. So it's something along the lines of relevant early evidence of a positive therapeutic outcome, which could be pretty much anything other than negative evidence that, that the product doesn't work. And then the confirmatory evidence can come from a wide variety of sources that I worry are not adequate. So, real world evidence through patient registries are not necessarily going to be convincing compared to rigorous, well-designed trials. And I think there's room for reasonable debate and disagreement about how much evidence do we need to have. I would feel a lot more flexibility about that if we could adjust price accordingly.
Yeah, but again, we're talking about sort of a subset of, it's not like Promising Pathway Act is for all drugs and medicines. We're talking about narrow conditions with serious, substantial unmet needs. So I think it goes back to the earlier point. I think there is room for flexibility on the confirmatory evidence side, and I do think that, it's in the FDA's current regulatory guidance that, patients with these serious diseases are willing to take more risks. So, we might not get the perfect drug, but if it's showing some promise, we're willing to take a chance. Yes, I totally agree with confirmatory evidence and taking it off the market if it's not working, but we're willing to give it a try.
I'm going to jump in real quick.
Yes, we have a couple audience questions. I'll toss it over to this lady first.
Hi, I'm Elizabeth Simpson with the Alliance for Patient Access. I want to thank all the panelists. I am thinking about the conversation on cost that we were on a second ago. And I know there's an upcoming ICER review in ALS, so I'm curious if y'all have thoughts on ICER and its impact on, perception around cost and effectiveness.
I mean,
ICER's a big
take that
question.
one. It's a pricing issue. All I can say is, as a person living with ALS, we don't only just want drugs approved the FDA, we want them to be available and covered and accessible. So I know the ICER, I think, report threw into question some of the value of the drugs, but I think if drugs are going to work, it's going to be something. I mean, I don't know all the ins and outs of that side, but I think that we need to find a way to get them covered and paid for. But I also just want to go back to we need to get the drugs paid for, and we need to potentially rely on a whole bunch of different drugs. So I think where ALS is moving is kind of a cocktail approach, like you may have seen in the old days with HIV or cancer treatments. And the Dr. Woods article that was referenced earlier, I think he really emphasized well how with pediatric oncology, there were drugs approved that had very little benefit, but once you put them together with other drugs, there was substantial benefit. And ultimately, I think that we're going to have to come to some, pricing is going to be a more complicated issue, but that's got to be part of the equation.
We're nearly out of time, but we have one more short audience question.
So very great discussion. Just curious, we know that RCTs are standard procedures, but what do you think it will take for real-world evidence and real-world data to be a part of that standard to really accelerate approvals in drug development?
Thank you.
Holly, would you like to start on that?
I hope we get there with real-world data and real-world evidence. I don't think we are nearly as close yet as some people would like to think we are, unfortunately. So the kind of tests that I've seen, right, trying to compare what we can learn from real-world data to well-designed clinical trials, they just don't match up yet. And I worry we're getting out a bit ahead of over our skis. With Congress pushing FDA to use real-world evidence in its approval decisions in a way that it might not yet be ready to support. Now, I hope that we'll devote resources to, improved electronic health records and other things that would allow us to make better use of real-world evidence, real-world data and evidence in appropriate circumstances. But I get very nervous when I hear people talking about it as a substitute for clinical trial data today.
I just think where there's an unmet need, there has to be some flexibility. And so I would favor looking at creative approaches and trying to come up with a way to build in real-world evidence. And there's been some therapies that are out there that maybe the statistical significance in the trial isn't that dramatic, but if you look at subset of populations, there are people who anecdotally, even with ALS, have seen improvements, which doesn't typically happen. So that you need to be monitoring and tracking and taking that into effect when you're considering the totality of the drug in the overall context.
That's absolutely right. And Holly, I mean, what you said is absolutely right too. We need to be collecting better data when we're thinking about using it in drug approvals. And need EHRs to be used in an actually meaningful way. We need data to be standard. We need data to be able to be used across different platforms. I think that in certain disease spaces, in certain areas where we're getting there, but just in terms of data collection as a just matter of practice day to day, we're not quite there yet.
I could continue asking questions all night long, but we are already over schedule anyway. So thank you three so much. This was a great discussion, and thank you all in the audience for the questions.
Thank you. Can we get another round of applause for this panel and for Sarah? That was excellent. That was great. Well, with that comes the close of our event. I just want to say thank you all so much for spending your evening with us today. I'm going to keep these remarks brief so that you can go over there and grab some food and some drinks. But I want to make sure I give a special thank you to our event sponsor, Alexion, AstraZeneca Rare Disease, for making this all possible. And another special thank you to our event squad over there in the corner. We have Julia Baker, Caitlin Clark, Shannon O'Callaghan, Britt Cipriano, and of course the man himself, Matt Harper. Thank you all again so much for joining us, and there's food, there's beverages out there in the back, so feel free to enjoy the rest of your Thursday night. Take care.